I found out my wife has been cheating on me for 5 years with her boss, and now they're both planning to take over my company and force me out of my own business. My name is Tom, 41M, and I've been married to Sarah, 39F, for 12 years. For most of those years, I thought we had a solid relationship. We had our ups and downs like any couple, but I believed we were happy. I run a successful tech company that I built from the ground up, while Sarah works as a marketing executive for a big corporation in the city. I always respected her career, even though mine kept me busy and often away from home. About 6 months ago, things started to feel off. Sarah became more distant, her phone glued to her hand at all times, and she started working late more frequently. I chalked it up to work stress or maybe a midlife crisis. I didn't want to pry, but there was something in the way she looked at me, or rather didn't look at me, that gnawed at the back of my mind. Then there was Mark, 44M, Sarah's boss. He was this slick, overly confident type, the kind of guy who walks into a room and expects everyone to fawn over him. I never liked him, and every time Sarah mentioned him in passing, I felt a twinge of jealousy. But I trusted her, so I pushed those feelings aside, convincing myself I was being paranoid. But the signs kept piling up. Sarah started taking trips for work conferences on weekends, and every time she came back, she seemed more detached. One night, when she said she was working late again, I decided to surprise her with dinner at her office. I thought maybe we could reconnect, spend some time together after she finished her shift. When I got to her building, I saw her car parked in the lot. I made my way up to her floor, my heart pounding with excitement and nervousness. But when I stepped out of the elevator, I noticed the office was dark, except for the light coming from Mark's corner office. I hesitated, not wanting to barge in, but something compelled me to check. As I approached, I heard hushed voices coming from inside. My heart sank when I recognized Sarah's voice, along with Mark's. I was about to knock when I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. 5 years, Sarah. 5 years we've been hiding this. Aren't you tired of sneaking around? Mark's voice was smooth, calm, but there was a sharpness to it, like he was growing impatient. Of course I am, Sarah replied, her voice soft but strained. But you know I have to play it carefully. Tom can't know. Not yet. I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath me. My wife, my Sarah, had been cheating on me for 5 years. My mind raced, trying to piece together how I had missed it for so long. How had I been so blind? I stepped back, trying to collect myself, but then I heard something that made the blood drain from my face. Once we have control of his company, Mark continued, you can finally leave him. We'll be set, he'll be out, and we'll take everything. Are you sure he won't suspect anything? Sarah asked, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Tom's smart. He built that company from scratch. He won't just let it go. That's where you come in, love, Mark replied, his voice dripping with confidence. You'll make sure the board is on our side. We'll edge him out before he even knows what's happening. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Not only had Sarah been unfaithful for half a decade, but she and her boss were plotting to take over my company, the business I had sacrificed so much for. I felt sick, like I was living in some kind of twisted nightmare. I stumbled away from the office door, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. I needed proof. I wasn't going to confront her yet. I needed to be smart about this. I quickly recorded a snippet of their conversation, just enough to confirm what I had overheard. Then I left the building, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The drive home was a blur. I couldn't believe this was happening. The betrayal, the deception, it felt like my whole world was crashing down around me. How could Sarah do this? How could she look me in the eye every day, share a bed with me, while plotting behind my back? When I got home, I sat in the dark, my thoughts spinning out of control. Every smile she had given me, every I love you she had whispered, it was all a lie. But now I wasn't just dealing with infidelity. I was dealing with a full-on conspiracy to destroy my life. They were going to take my company, my livelihood, everything I had worked for. I couldn't let them. I wouldn't let them. But I needed to be smart. I couldn't just go in guns blazing. If I played my cards right, I could expose them both and keep control of my company. But I had to be careful. One wrong move, and they could pull the rug out from under me. I spent the rest of the night going over everything in my head, planning my next move. I wasn't going to let them win. If Sarah and Mark thought they could outsmart me, they were sorely mistaken. The game had just begun. After that night, I knew I couldn't afford to let my emotions get the best of me. I had to play it cool. If Sarah or Mark caught even the slightest whiff of suspicion, they would close ranks, and my chance to expose them would be gone. For the next few days, I pretended everything was normal. It wasn't easy. Every time I looked at Sarah, a part of me wanted to scream, to confront her, to demand answers. But I forced myself to stay calm. The first thing I did was contact my lawyer, Greg, 44M, a no-nonsense guy who had helped me with the legal aspects of my business for years. I didn't tell him everything at first, just that I needed advice on how to protect my company from potential hostile actions. He agreed to discreetly look into some things for me, particularly around the company bylaws, ownership percentages, and how much sway the board members held. Next, I hired a private investigator named Claire, 38F. I needed more than just my suspicions and the little bit of recorded audio I had. Claire came highly recommended, and after a brief meeting, she agreed to dig into Sarah and Mark's relationship, as well as anything else that might help my case. I handed her the recording I'd made as a starting point. "You sure you want to go through with this?" Claire asked, her eyes sharp with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Once we start down this path, it's not going to be pretty." "I don't have a choice," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "They're plotting to take everything from me. I need to stop them before they destroy my life." Over the next week, I gathered every bit of information I could without tipping Sarah off. I made copies of all our financial documents, focusing on any unusual transfers or investments she had made recently. I noticed a few large withdrawals from our joint account, but nothing concrete enough to tie her to the scheme yet. I also started discreetly talking to a few trusted board members at my company, feeling out where their loyalties lay without giving away too much. One evening, as I sat in my home office reviewing the financial records, Sarah came in. She smiled at me, that same smile she had given me for years, the one I used to think was filled with love. Now it felt like a mask, hiding something dark and twisted beneath the surface. "Hey," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "You've been working a lot lately. Everything okay?" My heart raced, but I forced myself to act normal. "Yeah, just some extra stuff with the company. You know how it is." She walked over and put her arms around my shoulders, a touch light but cold. "Well, don't work too hard, okay? You know I'm always here if you need to talk about anything." The irony of her words nearly made me laugh, but instead, I just nodded, forcing a smile. "Thanks, babe. I appreciate it." She kissed me on the cheek and left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Every interaction with her felt like a test, like she was probing for any sign that I knew the truth. But I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. Not yet. A few days later, Claire called me with an update. She had managed to dig up some serious dirt on Mark. Not only was he seeing Sarah, but he had a history of manipulating women in his company, coercing them into relationships for career advancement. Sarah, it seemed, wasn't the first woman he had pulled into his web of lies and deceit. But she was the first one willing to go along with his scheme to take over a company. "I've also been following Sarah," Claire said, her tone professional but with an edge of disgust. "She's been meeting Mark regularly, but not just for their affair. They've been having meetings with lawyers and financial advisors. It looks like they're laying the groundwork for a hostile takeover of your company." My stomach churned. I had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. "Do you have any proof?" I asked, my voice tense. "I'm working on it," Claire replied. "But I'd recommend you start locking down your assets now. If they're as close as I think they are, you don't have much time." I thanked Claire and hung up, my mind racing. I had to move quickly. I immediately called Greg and told him to begin putting my contingency plans into action. We moved funds into protected accounts, reorganized the company's shares, and made sure that I still held majority control. I wasn't about to let Mark and Sarah steal everything from me without a fight. Over the next week, I continued gathering evidence. Claire managed to snap photos of Sarah and Mark meeting with their lawyers, which I kept in a secure file. I also managed to intercept a few emails between Sarah and Mark, in which they discussed the timeline for their plan to push me out of the company. It was sickening to read their cold, calculated messages, as if I were nothing more than an obstacle in their way. Then came the tipping point. One evening, I was reviewing some documents when I noticed a strange deposit in Sarah's personal bank account, $100,000 wired from an unknown source. I immediately called Claire to see if she could trace it. 2 days later, she got back to me. That money came from Mark's offshore account, Claire said. It looks like he's been funneling cash to Sarah for months, possibly to help with the takeover. They're moving fast, Tom. If you're going to act, now's the time. That was all I needed to hear. I had enough evidence to blow their plan wide open, but I wasn't going to confront them head-on just yet. I had to be smart about this. I couldn't let them know I was onto them until I had everything in place. The storm was coming, and I was ready for it. With the evidence piling up and time running out, I knew it was time to set my plan in motion. I couldn't allow Sarah and Mark to push me out of my own company and ruin everything I had worked for. But I had to be strategic. Confronting them without a solid plan would only give them the upper hand. I needed to strike hard and fast, catching them off guard and ensuring that they couldn't manipulate the situation in their favor. One evening, after a long day of carefully coordinating my legal defenses with Greg and reviewing the damning evidence Claire had gathered, I decided to initiate the first step. I invited Sarah out to dinner at one of our favorite restaurants, a high-end place downtown where we used to celebrate our milestones. It would be the perfect setting for what was about to go down. "Sure, that sounds lovely," Sarah said when I suggested it, her voice as sweet and false as ever. "It'll be nice to have some time together. We've both been so busy lately." Her words dripped with insincerity, but I played along, masking the fury simmering beneath the surface. I made sure to book a private table, somewhere quiet where we wouldn't be interrupted. As I sat across from her that evening, watching her sip wine and pretend like everything was normal, I felt a surge of disgust. How had I not seen through her lies earlier? "So, Tom," Sarah said casually, swirling her glass of Merlot, "how's everything going at work? You seem stressed lately. Anything I can help with?" I nearly choked on my water. The audacity of her to sit there, acting like a supportive wife, knowing full well that she and Mark were plotting behind my back. But I kept my composure. "Actually, work has been pretty interesting lately," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I've been learning a lot about who I can and can't trust." A smile faltered slightly, and I could see a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "What do you mean?" I took my time, letting the tension build. "Oh, just some unfortunate discoveries I've made recently. You see, I've come across some information that has opened my eyes to the truth." Sarah's hand paused mid-air, her glass hovering just inches from her lips. "What are you talking about?" I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "I know about you and Mark." Her face went pale, and for a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. But Sarah had always been quick on her feet, and she recovered almost instantly. She set her glass down carefully and met my gaze, her expression hardening. "Tom, I don't know what you think you know, but—" "Don't," I cut her off, my tone sharp. "Don't lie to me, Sarah. I know everything. I know about the affair, I know about the money, and I know about your plan to take over the company. I have evidence, emails, photos, bank statements. It's over." For the first time in our entire relationship, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was scrambling, trying to figure out how to talk her way out of this, but there was no escape. "I've already spoken to my lawyer," I continued, my voice steady and cold. "We've secured the company assets, and the board is on my side. You and Mark won't be taking anything from me. Not the company, not the house, not a single cent." Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for her wine glass, knocking it over in the process. The red liquid spilled across the table, staining the white tablecloth, but she barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on me, her face twisted in shock and anger. You can't do this," she finally spat, her voice low and venomous. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, but I do," I said, leaning in closer. "And if you don't want me to make all of this public, if you don't want everyone to know what kind of person you really are, you're going to sign over everything. The divorce settlement, your share of the assets, everything. And you're going to do it quietly, without a fight." Her eyes narrowed, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You're a bastard," she hissed. "You think you can just throw me away like this?" "I'm not the one who threw anything away," I replied, my voice calm. "You did that the moment you started sleeping with Mark and plotting behind my back." For a moment, Sarah looked like she was about to explode, her chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. But then, just as quickly, she seemed to deflate. The anger drained from her face, replaced by something else, something cold and calculating. "Fine," she said, her voice flat. "You want to play hardball? We'll see who wins this little game." With that, she stood up abruptly, knocking her chair back. She didn't even bother to look at me as she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the restaurant, leaving me alone at the table with the spilled wine and the wreckage of our marriage. I didn't move for a long time, just sat there, staring at the door she had disappeared through. I knew this wasn't the end. Sarah wasn't going to give up that easily, but now the battle lines were drawn, and I was ready for whatever came next. After Sarah stormed out of the restaurant that night, I knew the real fight was only just beginning. Over the next few days, I barely heard from her, but the silence was unnerving, like the calm before a storm. Every day, I braced myself for whatever move she would make next. I wasn't naive. I knew Sarah well enough to realize that she wouldn't walk away quietly, especially not after being cornered. A week passed before the first blow came. I was sitting in my office, reviewing some reports when my phone buzzed. It was Greg, my lawyer. "Tom, we have a problem," he said, his voice tense. "What's going on?" I asked, already feeling a pit forming in my stomach. "Sarah's lawyer just sent over a counter-proposal. She's not just fighting for half the assets. She's claiming that the company belongs to her as much as it does to you. She's alleging that she played an integral role in its success and that you wouldn't have built it without her." I felt a surge of anger and disbelief. She's insane. She never had anything to do with the business. I built it from the ground up while she was too busy. "Well, you know." "I know, Tom," Greg said calmly. "But she's trying to paint a picture that she was your partner, both in marriage and in business. She's also claiming emotional distress and is asking for a significant portion of the company profits moving forward." I could barely believe what I was hearing. Emotional distress? Partner in business? Sarah had done nothing but drag me down, and now she was trying to rewrite history. "She's also making personal claims," Greg added, hesitating slightly. "What kind of personal claims?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "She's alleging that you were emotionally abusive and controlling throughout the marriage. She's saying that she stayed with you out of fear and that you manipulated her into staying. That's part of her reasoning for why she started the affair with Mark. She claims you pushed her into it." I laughed bitterly. She's unbelievable. So now I'm the villain in her story. Greg sighed. "It's a classic move, Tom. She's trying to fit the narrative and make herself look like the victim. If she can convince the court of this, she could walk away with a significant settlement." My mind raced. I had never laid a hand on Sarah, never controlled her in any way. In fact, if anything, I had been too lenient, too trusting. And now she was using that against me, twisting the truth to fit her own agenda. "We'll fight this," I said firmly. "We have the evidence, and we'll prove that she's lying." But Greg's voice was cautious. "Tom, just be prepared. This isn't going to be an easy fight. Sarah is pulling out all the stops, and her lawyer is ruthless. We'll need to be strategic about how we proceed. We can't just rely on the evidence we have. We need to undermine her credibility." I knew Greg was right. The court battles would be ugly, and Sarah was clearly prepared to get her hands dirty. As much as I wanted to storm into court and expose her for the liar she was, I had to be careful. One wrong move, and it could all backfire. I spent the next few weeks gathering everything I had on Sarah. Every email, every text message, every piece of evidence that could prove her infidelity and her lies. I worked late into the night, determined to protect my company and my reputation. Meanwhile, Greg and his team worked on discrediting Sarah's claims of emotional abuse, pulling up records of our marriage counseling sessions, and even reaching out to friends and colleagues who could attest to my character. But Sarah wasn't idle either. She was working just as hard to destroy me. Rumors started spreading around the company, whispered in the hallways, and passed through emails that I wasn't supposed to see. People were talking about how I had driven her into Mark's arms, how I was a controlling and abusive husband. It was like watching my entire life unravel before my eyes. The worst part was that some people actually believed her. Mark had his own circle of influence, and between the two of them, they were working to turn people against me. It didn't matter that I had the facts on my side. Perception was everything, and Sarah was a master at playing the victim. Then one day, I received the email that changed everything. It was from Claire, my private investigator. She had been digging deeper into Sarah and Mark's relationship, looking for anything that could give us an edge in court. What she found was explosive. "Tom," her email began, "you're going to want to sit down for this. I've uncovered evidence that Sarah and Mark have been funneling company funds into a secret offshore account for months. They've been planning this for a long time, and they're not just trying to take over the company, they're trying to bankrupt it first. I've attached all the documentation I've gathered. It's more than enough to blow this case wide open." I stared at the screen in disbelief. Sarah and Mark hadn't just been having an affair, they had been embezzling money from the company right under my nose. And now with this new information, I finally had the leverage I needed. I immediately forwarded the email to Greg and set up a meeting to discuss our next steps. We couldn't just expose this in court. We needed to time it perfectly to make sure that when the truth came out, it would be devastating for Sarah and Mark. Over the next few days, I worked with Greg to build our case. We prepared to file criminal charges against both of them for embezzlement, and we coordinated with the board to ensure that when this news broke, they would be completely cut off from the company. There would be no way for them to weasel out of it. When Sarah and her lawyer got wind of what was coming, they tried to backpedal, offering a quiet settlement in exchange for my silence. But it was too late. I was done playing their game. I walked into the courtroom the day of the trial with my head held high, knowing that this was the moment everything would change. Sarah and Mark sat across from me, their expressions smug, as if they still believed they could win. But as the evidence was presented, the embezzlement, the affair, the lies, they quickly realized how wrong they were. By the time the trial was over, Sarah's lawyer was practically begging for a settlement. But I wasn't interested in negotiating. I wanted them both to face the consequences of what they had done. Sarah's face crumbled as the judge delivered the verdict. She was ordered to return every cent she had stolen, and she would receive nothing from the company. Mark's career was in ruins, and he faced potential jail time for his role in the embezzlement. It was a complete and total victory. But as satisfying as it was to see justice served, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with, had tried to destroy me for her own selfish gain. I had won, but the cost was high. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, I knew one thing for sure: I would never trust anyone like that again. The courtroom victory was supposed to be the end, the final chapter in this nightmare, but I quickly realized that this kind of betrayal leaves scars far deeper than any legal battle could settle. Sarah and Mark were publicly humiliated, sure. Their reputations were ruined, and their embezzlement scheme had landed them in a sea of legal trouble. But even as I watched them squirm under the weight of their own destruction, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in my gut. My life was in pieces. In the days following the trial, I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but every corner of my life seemed tainted by what had happened. I couldn't walk into my office without hearing whispers from my employees, wondering if I had somehow known about Sarah and Mark's betrayal all along. Friends and family were supportive, but even their sympathy was a reminder of how utterly I had been betrayed by the two people I trusted most. The company was safe for now. I had taken every precaution to cut Sarah and Mark off from any further access to our finances, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like survival. I had built that business from the ground up, and now it felt more like a monument to my failure than my success. No matter how many times people reassured me that I had won, it still felt like I had lost everything. One evening, as I sat in my empty house, drinking a glass of scotch that tasted like nothing, I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the last thing I wanted was company. But the knock persisted. Reluctantly, I got up and answered. Standing there, looking more disheveled than I had ever seen her, was Sarah. I hadn't seen her since the trial. Her once perfectly styled hair was messy, her face gaunt, and her eyes puffy from what I assumed were countless sleepless nights. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there on the doorstep, her shoulders slouched as if the weight of everything had finally crushed her spirit. "What do you want, Sarah?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice shaky, almost fragile. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to shut the door in her face, to tell her to go to hell, but against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let her in. I wasn't ready for what came next. "I'm sorry, Tom," she said the moment she stepped inside. I know that doesn't change anything, but I had to say it. I watched her carefully, waiting for the other shoe to drop. This was Sarah, after all. She wasn't here to apologize. She never did anything without an ulterior motive. "What are you really here for, Sarah?" I asked, cutting to the point. She bit her lip, her eyes welling up with tears. "I don't have anyone else to turn to." My stomach twisted. "What about Mark? Or your family?" She shook her head, letting out a bitter laugh. "Mark left me, Tom. The moment everything went public, he bolted. His wife took him back, and now he's playing the good family man, pretending none of this ever happened." I shouldn't have felt any sympathy for her, but in that moment I almost did. Almost. "And your family? They won't speak to me. My parents are mortified by everything. My brother hasn't returned a single one of my calls. They've all cut me off." It was hard to believe that someone as manipulative as Sarah had been reduced to this. She was a master at twisting people around her little finger. But now, standing in my living room, she seemed like a shell of the woman who had once so easily deceived me. "So, what do you expect from me?" I asked, folding my arms. She looked at me, her tear-filled eyes wide with desperation. "I don't know, Tom. I don't have anywhere else to go. I thought maybe we could talk. I thought maybe you'd understand." That's when it hit me. The real reason she was here. Sarah wasn't looking for forgiveness. She was looking for a way out of her own mess. She had no allies left, and in some twisted part of her mind, she thought I'd be her safety net. Maybe she even thought I'd take her back. "You thought I'd take you back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Her silence confirmed it. I laughed. I couldn't help it. It was a bitter, hollow laugh that echoed through the empty house. "After everything you did, you really thought I'd take you back?" I didn't know what else to do. She snapped, her mask slipping. "I didn't want any of this to happen, Tom. I never wanted to hurt you." "Bullshit," I shot back, my anger flaring. "You wanted exactly this. You wanted to take everything from me, my business, my reputation, everything I built. You and Mark planned this from the start." "No," she protested, tears streaming down her face now. "It wasn't like that. Mark manipulated me too. I didn't know how deep it went until it was too late." "Save it," I said, shaking my head. "I don't believe a single word that comes out of your mouth anymore, Sarah. You're only here because you've run out of options, and you think I'm still the fool who loved you enough to save you." Her expression crumbled at my words. She looked like she might collapse right there in front of me, but I didn't care anymore. I had spent too long being her puppet. I wasn't about to let her play me again. "Please, Tom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't have anyone else. Just let me stay here for a while. I'll find a way to fix things, I promise." I stared at her, my heart pounding with anger and disbelief. She had the audacity to ask me for help after everything she'd done. after she tried to destroy me. "No, Sarah," I said, my voice cold and final. "You need to leave. Now." Her eyes widened in shock. "Tom, please." I said, "Leave," I shouted, pointing toward the door. "Get out of my house. You're not welcome here anymore." She hesitated for a moment, her face crumbling into despair. But when she realized that I wasn't going to change my mind, she turned and walked out the door without another word. I watched her leave, a strange sense of closure washing over me. It wasn't the kind of closure I had imagined. There was no satisfaction, no triumph. But as Sarah disappeared into the night, I knew I was finally free. Free from her lies, her manipulation, and the toxic relationship that had nearly destroyed me. As I closed the door behind her, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The battle was over, and I had come out on top. But the scars would remain, a reminder of how close I had come to losing everything. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I was okay with that.